Good morning, I'm Mat Schaffer. Welcome to the Boston Sunday Review. Stephen Hassan is America's best-known cult expert. He joins us this morning on the Boston Sunday Review. Steve, good morning and welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Matt.
You recently republished your landmark book, Combating Cult Mind Control, that was first published back in 1988, 10 years after the Jonestown Massacre. How has the definition of cults changed since then, particularly in the minds of the American people?
That's a really interesting question. That's why they pay you. So I think back in the 70s, there was a stereotypical image of people wearing robes or shaved heads or compounds with people who are announcing they were messiahs, avatars, perfect masters. And so back then there was more of a public consciousness journalism and media presence that was really concerned about educating the public, unlike today, where people are afraid to talk about the subject. They're afraid of being sued by particular groups or harassed by particular groups like Scientology. I'll name them. And unfortunately, media has been silenced to a large extent. And even on the internet, which when it started was a great boon for my work and for people who've been victimized by destructive cults. Now search engines are being clogged intentionally. Wikipedia posts are being sanitized and propagandized by large funding and endless amounts of people. So I also want to just say that for me, over the 40 years that I've been doing this work as a mental health professional, I've shifted my focus out of the word cults, even though my book has cult in the title, and even mind control, to the term undue influence. And I'm using that term along with my colleagues because it's a known legal concept that's 500 years old. It talks about exploitation and traditionally it's been affiliated with children and elderly people. But what we now know about the evolution of psychology is that intelligent, educated people can be deceived, can be hypnotized covertly, can be indoctrinated and brainwashed. And so we're working on updating the legal system.
You have been exploring something that you call the science of social influence.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. So, for example, when I was deprogrammed in May 11th, 1976, the work that helped me wake up was the work of psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, who had been an Air Force military intelligence psychiatrist studying Chinese communist brainwashing. And it was his landmark book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, that outlined 8 criteria by which any environment may be judged as a thought reform or a brainwashing environment. And over the years, I've taken his model. Margaret Singer was an Army psychologist studying brainwashing as well, and I've created a model called the BITE model of mind control, which stands for control of behavior is the B, control of information is the I, control of thoughts and thinking is the T, and control of emotions is the E. And I've broken it down into a laundry list of variables where people can look at any relationship, whether it's a dysfunctional family or a controlling boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife, or a corporate owner, or a religious institution, or a psychotherapist, anybody, and analyze whether or not this is a healthy environment in terms of encouraging people to think for themselves, be in touch with their own conscience, have an ability to think analytically and critically, do independent research and talk to former members and critics and make up their own minds about things. And one of my mentors, Philip Zimbardo, of the famous Zimbardo prison study, actually taught a course at Stanford for 15 years called The Psychology of Mind Control, and it used 2 chapters from the original Combating Cult Mind Control. And it's people like him that have really stepped out and said, you know what? This really is a fact. People are organically wired to learn and adapt to their environment and survive. And you can manipulate people's information and their environment, their sleep, their food, their clothing, their language system, their beliefs, and get them to be dependent and obedient slaves.
I'm certainly no expert, but it seems to me that the stereotype of what a cult was back in the 70s or 80s would be something, a self-contained group that kept itself away from other people, whereas today it's much more amorphous, and people can be linked to each other in a very deep fashion through texting or
Exactly.
the internet or by sharing certain beliefs.
Exactly. In fact, the kinds of interventions I did in the 70s and 80s is no longer possible with smartphones and GPS location devices and texting and phone calls, because the controller is manipulating the person remotely or through the internet. I just recently did an intervention out in LA with a woman who was controlled by a man 14 years older. The woman's cell phone was owned by the parents on a family share thing, and they looked up and they saw that he was texting and calling her 3 to 6 hours a day.
You believe that an organization like ISIS, an activity like human trafficking, and a country like North Korea may all be unduly influencing individuals in, for lack of a better expression, cult-like
Exactly.
fashions.
Exactly. Black and white, us versus them, good versus evil, complete and total control over people's ability to step out of their mindset and look at another point of view, not unlike the propaganda of a certain presidential candidate, which is very interesting for me as an expert on this, to watch the language, to listen to it, to watch and talk to the followers of Trump, who I like to quote John Oliver's Drumpf, his German ancestral name. In fact, I have a hat, Drumpf. The situation has evolved dramatically, and I'm counseling and helping people who've been remotely indoctrinated and controlled through the internet.
So what's so interesting about you is that you actually went over to the other side for a while. How were you recruited by the Unification Church in the 1970s? And for listeners who have no idea what the Unification Church was or is, what is it?
Right. And in fact, when I did the recent update of Combating, because most young people don't know anything about the Moonies, largely because they are a media empire themselves. They own the Washington Times newspaper. They have the video broadcast facility for all the major networks. No one's talking about the moon cult, but Sun Myung Moon claimed to be the Messiah, greater than Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad, and wanted to take over the world.
What time is this?
I was recruited in February of 1974, by the way, the same month that Patty Hearst was abducted by force. And essentially, he was most well known for his mass weddings, where he would line up thousands of men and women and point at them and say, you and you. And they had 5 minutes to decide if they accepted God's choice for the perfect mate. And I dropped out of Queens College. I quit my job. I donated my bank account. I was deceptively recruited at the cafeteria at Queens College.
If I remember correctly, a bunch of people sat down next to you and they kind of just sort of started a conversation, and then and very strategically used love and guilt
Yeah,
to get you involved.
So I was situationally vulnerable, Matt, like a lot of people are to destructive mind control. So people who break up with a relationship, which was my case, my girlfriend dumped me, and so my recruiters were 3 women who were flirting with me, and who I had, they said they were students and they weren't. But so people who are situationally vulnerable, death of a loved one, illness, graduation, losing a job, moving to a new city, state, or country, these are all life cycle vulnerabilities that everyone faces at some point or another. And in my case, I was groomed by these recruiters. I later became an expert recruiter, so I know
You rose through the organization.
I didn't actually rise. I was selected by one of Moon's top right-hand people to be his disciple. So I was like hand-chosen and hand-indoctrinated to take over the world and to abolish the evil democracy and set up a theocracy to rule the world for God. And fast for Nixon, because God wanted Nixon to be president during Watergate. I actually fasted.
Maybe you might have done a better job.
Just insane. If it hadn't happened to me, Matt, I'd never believe an intelligent, educated, stable person could ever be made into a mind control robot, but it happened to me.
Tell us how you came to leave the church.
Essentially, I was told by my leaders to cut off from my family because they were evil and satanic, that I had to be true to my true parents, Moon and his second wife. I was sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night every single day, working 7 days a week for no money. And I was moved out of the New York area because they were afraid I was going to be kidnapped and deprogrammed. At least that's what they told me, why they were moving me out. And I fell asleep at the wheel of a fundraising van after 3 days of no sleep and woke up driving into the back of a tractor-trailer truck at 80 miles an hour and miraculously survived the crash. And it was those 2 weeks in the hospital recovering with my right leg in a cast from my toes to my groin that I made a call violating the rules to my sister Thea, who I was always very close with. And she was the agent who said, you have a nephew you haven't met yet, and I miss you, and I want him to know his Uncle Steve and come and visit. And I said, I can arrange it if you promise not to tell the parents or Steph, my oldest sister, because they were satanic. And she lured me to her house and broke her promise and told my parents, who hired a bunch of ex-members. And we did a 5-day deprogramming.
Wow.
And I should say it started involuntarily, where they took my crutches away. And after my father broke into tears, and because I said I'm not going to agree to this, and I want out, and I'm going to be violent if you try to hold me against my will, he broke into tears, and he said, "What would you do if it was your son, your only son, who met a group of people and dropped out of college and quit his job and cut off from his family? How would you feel?" And I stepped into his shoes with those tears because I had never seen my father cry like that. And I thought, wow, he really loves me. Wow, I'd probably be as worried as he is. Even though I was still brainwashed to think Moon was the Messiah, my father had been brainwashed by the evil media. So I agreed to basically listen for another 4 days, and then he said, I'll drive you back myself, but your mother and I at least will be able to sleep at night knowing we did the responsible thing, because we want to know that you understand what mind control is.
I'm just curious, as somebody who's sitting here 40 years later, probably close to the age that your dad was then.
And I have a 13-year-old son.
How does it feel now?
I feel so grateful. I get a little teary even thinking about it, and it's kind of why I've spent 40 years helping people around the world rescue their loved ones and helping people who've walked out of these groups and to recover. I just feel grateful. And I feel privileged that despite this horrible experience, I've been able to turn it around and help others.
Or because of this horrible experience, you've been able to do it.
Yeah, I wouldn't wish it for anybody, but I can tell you from my work helping sex trafficking victims, the most effective people to help others are the survivors, the people who've been there.
Who've walked the path before.
Exactly.
You believe influence is a natural part of life, but undue influence is not. How does one go from influence to undue influence?
So I visualize a continuum. If one visualizes a line with the arrow going to the left of healthy, constructive influence and the line to the right of destructive or undue influence. The forces on the left side respect people's individuality, their uniqueness. They're honest, they're accountable, they're responsible. Children should grow up to become individuated adults, able to have the locus of control for their lives within themselves. And the destructive side of it is about fear, guilt, manipulation, cloning. I call it cloning. Dependence and obedience to some external authority figure or to some external belief system where they're disconnected from their body, they're disconnected from their conscience, they're disconnected from their creativity and their spontaneity.
For the most part, most people don't join these organizations, they are recruited.
Exactly.
What are the basic approaches?
So it's a critical point about undue influence is the use of deception, either deliberate lying or withholding vital information or distorting information to make it palatable and kind of spoon feed the person in order to get into that mindset of indoctrination. So recruitment often happens through a friend or a relative, a coworker, or it could be an attractive member of the same sex if you're gay or the opposite sex if you're heterosexual. It could be a teacher, could be a therapist, could be a yoga instructor. And these folks who've already been co-opted genuinely believe and sincerely believe they're doing a good thing by deceiving you and manipulating you as it had been done to them, to bring you to this new enlightenment or to this new paradigm of beingness. It's incredible how many destructive cults use the fear card, and the most well-known one is Armageddon. Armageddon is happening any moment. Jesus is going to return, or any other variation of it in different religions. And so rather than cultivating a long-term respect for the earth and protecting its resources and thinking about, I am my brother's keeper and my sister's keeper, it's this notion that somehow magically and mystically God is going to wipe out all of the unrighteous, which means everyone not in your particular version or your particular institution of the truth. And it negates people's personal responsibility to not do to others what you don't want done to you.
And very briefly, how long does it take, or how long can it take?
Unfortunately, with the use of covert hypnotic techniques, if someone is a high hypnotizable and someone is a very skilled agent, it can be done very, very fast. I worked with one woman who had been praying that morning that God tell her what to do with her life. She was walking with 2 packages of groceries to her car to bring home to her children, and a robed, bearded man walked up to her and said, Jesus has sent me, you must follow me now. And when the police were following on the missing person, there were 2 bags of groceries with an open door to her car, and she was gone for years before we could find her.
When we come back, we're going to discuss mind control, in the 21st Century with Steve Hassan. You're listening to the Boston Sunday Review. Good morning, I'm Mat Schaffer. Welcome back to the Boston Sunday Review. If you're just tuning in, our guest is Steve Hassan. He's the author of Combating Cult Mind Control and one of the nation's best-known experts on cults, and he's joining us this morning here on the Boston Sunday Review. Steve, let's talk a little bit about the concept of mind control. What do you mean by mind control? And would most of us know if we were under mind control?
That's a great question. In fact, Matt, when I do trainings, I ask the question, how would one know if they were under mind control? And then I let everyone think about it for a few minutes, and really nobody understands how they would know. And quickly, my prescription is that they would need to leave the environment or the person that's influencing them, take at least a week away. They need to study models of mind control, which includes the Lifton model and my Bite model of mind control. They need to listen to and look at material from critics and former members, all the information the controller would not want them to see. Then they'd need to reflect over their experience from the moment they first heard of the person or the group, and analyze for themselves whether or not they were being lied to, whether they were being pressured, manipulated, whether their sleep was being harmed, whether their language was being changed. So there's this whole laundry list that's on my website, freedomofmind.com, or is in my book, that anyone can go through and then analyze for themselves whether this group is healthy or not. And the key concept, Matt, is where's the locus of control for your life? Is it within you, for your thoughts, your feelings, and your choices, or is it deferring to some other belief system or person? And if it's an external locus of control and you're 18, 19, 20, 21, 30, 50, it should be internal locus of control of your mind.
And in this particular society, where we grow up with stereotyped visions of romance, and where being alone is not something that people are comfortable with or confident about, so many people like to put their locus inside someone else.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that we're not teaching young people, as we're teaching them math and social studies and history, that we're not teaching people about healthy relationships and healthy communication patterns. It's a shame we're not demanding people take a course before they get a marriage license on conflict resolution. And essentially, as a mental health professional, I would say what the ideal paradigm is an interdependent relationship, not a dependent one or an independent one, but an interdependent, where you have two adult people who are choosing to share their lives, but they're not giving up their sense of self to the other.
Your model of mind control is a 4-component model you call BITE, the B standing for behavior, the I standing for information, the T standing for thought, and the E standing for emotion. And the 3 steps to using that model to gain control of a person's mind, you believe, are first unfreezing, then changing, and then refreezing. Can you explain?
Sure. So the unfreezing, changing, refreezing is a model from Kurt Lewin, actually, that I first learned about in a book called Course of Persuasion by Edgar Schein, who was one of the people with Lifton and Singer studying brainwashing in the 50s. And it talks about breaking down a person's sense of self, disorienting them, confusing them, overwhelming them with information, for example, or giving them drugs to disorient them. And as their sense of self is unfrozen, then indoctrinating them, often through repetition, monotony, rhythm, surrounding them with other believers, isolating them from the world, and then the refreezing of the new cult identity that has the new beliefs, the new patterns of thought, feeling, behavior. So the BITE model, which I basically created to give attribution, is largely based on the work of Leon Festinger, who is a psychologist who developed a theory called cognitive dissonance theory. He wrote a book called When Prophecies Fail, about a UFO cult, actually. And he was very perplexed why, if the leader said the spaceship is coming to the mountain on a certain date and everybody goes up to the mountain and then the spaceship doesn't come, he was perplexed why people didn't just lose faith and walk away, but they in fact believed more. And so the cognitive dissonance theory talks about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, which are the three of the four components of the BITE model. And the theory says that if we change one of the three, the other two will shift to reduce dissonance. So if you get someone to do an extreme behavior, there's a justification element, belief-wise, and an emotional alignment with that behavior, which is one reason why ISIS is getting people to do these horrendous acts very quickly, because it helps solidify their cult identity.
Is the goal to turn the recruited into a recruiter?
So the answer is yes, and it actually turns out that the one powerful technique for reinforcing a person's new cult identity is recruiting others. So it's actually propelling the person deeper in. And I can think back to my own moon experience, and it was when I got my first recruits that I was told I have to really turn off any of my doubts now, because now I'm a parent spiritually of these people, and I have to be a good parent to them.
What is the role of the internet in today's cult recruitment, and especially smartphones and social media?
So, unfortunately, we are wired through the internet, through search engines, through Facebook, through LinkedIn, through Twitter, etc. And it's very fascinating to see how people's brains are getting rewired into the internet. And I want to throw out another idea from left field on you, Matt, right now. But I listened to a fellow named Steve Silberman who wrote a book called Neurotribes about people who are Asperger's and on the autistic spectrum who dominate Silicon Valley. And he more or less has proposed the idea that because people on the spectrum are more comfortable with things and computers than human beings, they're organized their reality to feel more comfortable for them, and they're rewiring us, quote, neurotypicals to be more like them on the spectrum, and it's very concerning for the human species.
So that leads to the question, are all cults destructive?
No, they're not actually. And it comes, you can have an obsessive, excessive devotion to a band or a party or a person. But the key issue is whether or not you have informed consent, whether you have critical thinking, you have the ability to exercise free will. A quick funny story, I was approached years ago by a fellow who said, I want to interview you for a book that I'm writing about computers. I said, computers? What are you talking about? I said, what's the title of your book? He said, The Cult of Mac. And I laughed and I said, I'll do the interview, but I have to first disclose that I've only been using Apple since 1982 and I have 5 Macs right now. So I'm in a book called The Cult of Mac.
You mentioned earlier the intervention that occurred for you and that you underwent deprogramming. Is deprogramming a phrase that you would use today, and is what our listeners consider intervention actually what an intervention is?
Yeah, so words are the tools we use to think. And back in the 70s, when I did do involuntary interventions, it really involved holding people against their will or getting a court-ordered conservatorship to hold someone against their will. And it was incredibly traumatic, although it was often successful. And I've spent my career distancing myself from that term because cults have been indoctrinating their members with phobias against me, saying that I kidnap and beat and torture them to get them out of the group. However, the term is the best term that people still use in the media and otherwise.
Deprogramming.
Deprogramming. So I've started using it again with qualifiers. And what
Well, you've come up with something that you call strategic interactive approach,
right,
which is just, I guess, another way of saying deprogramming.
So what I've evolved, instead of a 3-day intervention where the person's confronted with the fact that there is information about brainwashing and mind control and critical information about the group, which really pushes buttons in a very big way. What I've evolved is essentially a network approach where I work with family members, friends, ex-members, clergy to devise an ethical influence campaign to empower the person to think for themselves. So our biggest tool is asking a good question and then being patient and silent while we want the person to think about it. And so I coach the family what questions to ask. And here's one of the critical techniques that I talk about in my work, which is under the T of the bite model, one of the techniques that cults program in people is something called thought stopping. So, for example, when my father found out Moon had an M16 gun factory, he immediately called me up when I was in the cult and said, "Steve, what kind of messiah has an M16 gun factory?" And what he didn't realize, he had good intentions. He made me start chanting, crush Satan, glory to heaven, peace on earth, glory to heaven, peace. I was taught to do this thought-stopping technique to shut out Satan's evil influences. So it actually propelled me deeper in. So the technique that I'm encouraging my clients to use is to study other cults, ones that their loved one would agree is a destructive cult. For example, Heaven's Gate. They did an exit video before they died talking about how happy they were and they weren't in a cult, or the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints or David Koresh or any number of other cults. Show them videos, have a conversation with them about how did these people come to believe what they believed, and ask them, how is your experience different? And it's a method that's really based on respect and thoughtfulness and care. And, hey, if what you're doing is true and it's so great, convince me. Let me join. And that kind of approach really works with a lot of cases.
Tell us about the link between mind control and human trafficking.
So, essentially, pimps and traffickers, I hate to say this, actually have written books and manuals, some of which are on Amazon, how to become a pimp and how to brainwash the hose. And they literally studied this technology of influence. And for me, the roots of it go back to a destructive cult called the Children of God. The leader was Moses David Berg. He was a pedophile. He sent his women out as happy hookers for Jesus, advocated sexual activity with 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds. And people ran away from that group, having been raised in that group, and got picked up by pimps and started explaining to pimps what was the family. And so pimps started using some of the religious terminology even in order to recruit and indoctrinate vulnerable young people. I want to add that the statistics are that the average age of someone getting into trafficking, sex trafficking, is 14. And the statistics are that if someone who's a minor gets taken in by authorities, they go back to the pimp 12 to 14 times because the authorities have not understood that they are programmed like cult members to go back to their guru, to block any doubts that traffic victims are given a new name, a new clothing, a new system. And by working with survivors, I've helped to develop a curriculum called Ending the Game. Website is endingthegame.com. And it's a 10-session program to teach survivors what the pimp's game is. That's their term. Pimps are the game. And we want people to end the game by reclaiming their lives.
Do Al-Qaeda and ISIS fit your definition of destructive cults?
Absolutely. And the thing is that many people confuse the religion of Islam with terrorist cults. And I've been talking about this since 9/11, that we need to make a distinction between Jewish, Christian, Muslims, and terrorist cults within those three different religions, and understand that the methodology for countering ISIS is really going to be rooted in understanding and applying what we've learned about cult mind control, and not militarily.
So guns and drones are not effective weapons?
No, in fact, if the guns and drones kill civilians, it actually recruits more people into the cults, unfortunately.
You believe our society is complacent when it comes to the threat of these kind of mind-controlling organizations?
I think people have become confused with freedom of religion. I think the clarity comes when understanding you can't be free to practice a religion if you don't have freedom of mind first. And when a group is systematically using deception and manipulation and hypnosis and mind control to deprive people of freedom of mind, they should not be given tax exemption status. And in fact, the laws need to be updated to what we now know about psychology. And that's kind of the work now that I'm 62, as I see the next 10 years. We need to bring precedent-setting legal cases on behalf of survivors to educate the public.
And do we use the tools that they use against them?
We use the knowledge of those tools, but what my solution is to out the techniques. And that's why I've written 3 books and I've been on television shows and radio shows for 40 years. What's going to help all of humanity survive is if everybody understands these techniques and applies them in a constructive, ethical way.
So once they're in the sunlight,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the power goes away.
Exactly, because it's not mystical, it's not magical. People are not reading minds and floating across the room. They're being hypnotized to visualize that experience. So it really, and the survivors are our best tools. The former members of ISIS, if I could help educate them and interview them and get them speaking on the internet and create intervention teams and have activists on the internet and go into all the discussion groups, we can really stop this largely.
And that is clear thinking.
Yeah, because one part of dealing with a disease is successful diagnosis, and because I was there, and because I come from a Jewish background, educated about the Holocaust, and within a few months I was losing my ability to think for myself and my own value system, to the point that when Moon was saying, when we take power in America and amend the Constitution, we'll make it a capital offense for people to have sex with people outside of the Unification Church. And I thought that was a great idea, to kill people en masse if they weren't following the rules.
You left the 2 grocery bags by the open front door.
I didn't understand what happened to me. I thought God had summoned me to save the planet. And that's what they said to me. Steve, you're standing at a historical moment of the world. Are you going to go back and study poetry at Queen's College, or are you going to follow God summoning you? And I'm like, actually, I said I want to go home and think about it. I really did. My mother said, let's go talk to the rabbi. I actually went to see the rabbi. He was clueless. All he would have needed to say is, Steve, I've never heard of this group before, but I can tell you if this group is legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny. Take a few weeks. Let's research it together. Then I wouldn't have gotten in. But then again, as you were saying earlier, Matt, then I wouldn't have had this life.
Right. You wouldn't be here today saving all these lives. The book is called Combating Cult Mind Control by Steve Hassan. You can learn more about this and all of Steve's work by visiting his website at freedomofmind.com. Steve Hassan, please come back and join us again. It was great to have you here.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. And thanks for your good questions, Matt.
You're listening to the Boston Sunday Review.